Welcome to Leading for Life Stories, Season 3. I'm Bob Judson, I'm the host for this podcast, and I'm absolutely delighted to have you here joining me. Regardless of whether you're a seasoned listener who's been with me since the beginning, or whether you've just dropped in for the occasional episode, I really hope you enjoyed the mix of content that I provide, the personal stories, the thematic episodes, and the guests that I have on the show. And I hope you find it all interesting and at least some of it useful. And without further ado, let's go. Welcome back, everybody. This week I'm going to do things in slightly reverse order because normally I start with my introduction and then I finish off with talking about some of the bits that are kind of administrative around the podcast. But actually, it's really important that you think about subscribing, please, if you're not already doing that. If you're watching on YouTube, hit subscribe to the channel right now, and that will make a really big difference. If you're listening on a podcast platform, please follow the podcast so that actually you get early notification, but also it helps in terms of boosting the podcast visibility across all those various channels. So it makes a difference to what I do. If you're into reviewing, then I would be really, really grateful because a review is really important in terms of getting, again, that honest, candid view of what you think, because it gets others to listen and others to watch, and that's what we really want. If you're finding it really valuable and the material's really valuable to you, then as I've often said before, please think about doing some financial support. If it's within your means to do so, I would be really, really grateful just to turn around and effectively pay a cup of coffee a month from a branded outlet on Patreon. That's all it takes to be either a supporter or a champion or a patron of the show. The latter two will probably be buying me the sticky bun as well as the cup of coffee. But all of that is hugely, hugely appreciated because it makes a real difference to the viability of the show and what I actually do. I do it for free, and obviously you can continue to watch for free. But if you're thinking it's valuable to you, please think about continuing to support it in that actual tangible way, which will make a really big difference to what I do. My guest this week, though, is a really, really good one. So Lord Kim Darroch, former National Security Advisor, former UK Ambassador to the United States of America, and a very, very distinguished and long diplomatic career before that he'll talk about in the show. Kim really came to prominence, I guess, through his time in the United States when Donald Trump was in his first term as president. And unfortunately, some of his diplomatic telegrams and correspondence back to the UK got leaked to the media. Now, ambassadors are paid to make honest appraisals of the countries that they're working in and feed those back to government in the UK. And that is absolutely what's expected of them. What they're not expecting, of course, is that honest appraisal to get leaked out to the media and the potential implications that come from that, where things that were said under specific circumstances to specific audiences are not necessarily intended to be circulated to a really wide and perhaps unfettered criticism audience that is the world's media today. And that really cost Kim dear. He did the honourable thing ultimately and resigned from his post, which, when you read his book, and I strongly recommend you do, Collateral Damage is a terrific book. It really makes it clear that actually in hindsight, he thinks what he said was the right thing. He was being honest. He was being absolutely clear about what he thought was actually happening at the time. And ultimately it cost him his career, which I think is a terrible shame. And he talks a little bit about that as well, talks about some of the aspects around all of that. But leadership in general, he's been at that very, very senior level as basically a diplomat of many, many years, standing in some really senior roles with some really crunchy stuff to do and deliver. And it's a great conversation. I really hope you enjoy it. Off we go. Kim, thank you so much for joining. What a privilege to have you on the podcast. I'm really delighted. I know there's lots of stuff that not only very your history, but also very current stuff that I think might be really interesting to touch on. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to chat, Bob.
No, it's a privilege. Thank you very much indeed. I mean, just to kick us off, you've had an amazing career, culminating obviously with your time as US Ambassador or UK Ambassador in the US. But before that, National Security Advisor, long time doing European stuff, lots of diplomatic stuff before that. It would just be really helpful, I think, just to set out a little bit of your career story, if you don't mind, to start us off with.
Okay. Um, I mean, let me start right at the beginning to say at university, Durham University, I studied zoology, which is about as far from a classic subject for a diplomat to have studied as you can get. And I still believe I'm the only zoology graduate who has ever come through Foreign Office. Why did a zoology graduate, with, by the way, a very average degree, join the Foreign Service? Well, when I left university, I was going to take a year off. And at that stage, I had absolutely no idea what I wanted to do. And I sometimes say to people, I still don't know really what I want to do with my life, but I drifted into the Foreign Service, and that filled up sort of the first 40 years of a career. And the reason I applied at all was because my then girlfriend, who has now been my wife for 45 years, said, well, give it a go. You like travel, you follow current affairs very closely, just have a go. There's nothing to lose. And I did. And to my astonishment, but probably the even bigger astonishment of my friends, I got through. And that's literally how I drifted into the Foreign Service. And they obviously didn't know quite what to do with me at the beginning. So after some training stuff in what was called protocol department, they put me in the news department, which was the Foreign Office press office, which is an extraordinary place to send someone who is effectively a new entrant. But I think they thought, this guy's a bit strange, a bit different from all the others. Let's put him in front of journalists and see how that goes. And so I did 2.5 years as the most junior press spokesman in news department, which meant I got a lot of weekends to do and Friday nights and that kind of thing on duty. But it was extraordinary fun. The big story at that time, Bob, was the negotiations to end the civil war in Rhodesia,
Hmm.
which ended with the Lancaster House Conference and the deal and the National Front, Patriotic Front, they were called, agreeing to a ceasefire and elections where the hope of the British government at the time had been that the moderate Bishop Muzorewa would win, and instead Mugabe and Nkomo, the Patriotic Front, won in a landslide, which wasn't the idea at all. But you have elections and people choose who they want to vote for, and that's who they chose. I think there was a lot of voting on tribal grounds. So this was a big, big story at the time. The other big story at the time was the Shah fleeing Iran. And I remember vividly, we had a brilliant ambassador there called Tony Parsons. And he took it, and it wasn't his fault, but he always took it as his own fault that he hadn't predicted this. And he was in limbo for a little while in the office, and he filled in his time by delivering a series of speeches about how the UK had got it wrong in Iran, hadn't seen the revolution coming. And I remember going to one of those, and he stood there for 50 minutes, spoke without a single sentence of notes, quite rivetingly. And for a guy who was basically saying mea culpa, it was the most extraordinary performance. There was no surprise to me when he was appointed by Margaret Thatcher as High Man to the UN, where he was the star show during the Falkland crisis in the United Nations. So from the outset, it was a fascinating job. I was posted, my first posting was to Japan as the non-Japanese expert. There was this strange theory at the time that people who spent 2 years learning Japanese might go a little bit native. And so you should always have one person in the country who was just sent there, like as any other posting, who wasn't a specialist, who would sort of bring a bit of objectivity to things.
With no
And that
language
was
training at all at that
no
point.
language training at all. I mean, I did some while I was there, enough to know how to order a beer in a Tokyo bar, and I played a lot of sports when I was there, so it was squash and tennis and the words you needed for that kind of stuff.
Well, I didn't realize we did that because that must have been really tough. I mean, if Japan in particular, I mean, lots of these nations where they've got, very difficult languages and, tough to break in. I mean, that
Yeah.
must be quite hard work working out there.
Except my job was to deal with the foreign ministry because I was covering Japanese foreign policy. And the primary requirement for a Japanese diplomat is he has to learn English, has to speak English. So all of their business was conducted in English. Some of the Japanese national newspapers would run an English language edition. So in terms of doing the work, and there were people in the embassy who would translate notes for you, that kind of thing, if there was stuff that came in Japanese. So that was all actually fine. And the trickiest thing was getting around the country because it's a most wonderful place to travel around. And you learnt to drive around the country, not really ever knowing where you were going, but following a particular kanji symbol that might look like, I don't know, a tree next to a stool or a house with a roof or whatever. And that was whatever town you were trying to get to. And again, although it's a long, thin series of islands, Japan, because an awful lot of it is very mountainous, actually it's a bit undersupplied with roads. So the main roads, you could stick to them and you could travel long distances and know exactly where you were going. Because when you got into actually finding your hotel or your ryokan or whatever, it got a bit tricky. But no, we had a fabulous time and we traveled out of Tokyo, whether skiing or in the summer going to the coast most weekends. And it was in terms of interest. I loved all our postings, but if you had to name one, that was my favorite one.
Nice.
But I then did a couple of years running, essentially running, being secretary of the Anglo-French process to draft a treaty to allow the Channel Tunnel to be built. The Channel Finks Link Treaty was called. It was signed at Canterbury School in, I think, 1987. It was Margaret Thatcher's big project. And she and Mitterrand had this celebratory lunch when the treaty was signed. And, wherever I travel through the Channel Tunnel, I think, wouldn't be here but for the treaty that I played a part in negotiating. And then I went to be private secretary to the minister dealing with the Middle East. And again, I'm not a Middle Eastern expert, but in that job, I traveled to probably three-quarters of the Middle Eastern countries. And I remember going to a meeting with Yasser Arafat, the first meeting with the British minister with Yasser Arafat in about 1988, made the front pages of the newspapers. William Aldergrave was the minister, shook hands with Yasser Arafat, and I actually have something he gave me to this day, which has a little card signed by him in it. And then, of all things, I shook hands with Saddam Hussein because we did a visit to Iraq in about 1989 when we were backing Iraq over Iran in the Iran-Iraq war of the late 80s. So actually, we were honored guests in Baghdad, and Saddam Hussein released a British businessman who'd been in prison for bribery to mark our visit, a man called John Smith. I didn't get into the meeting with Saddam because that was only the ambassador and the minister, but he shook hands with all of the delegation until I had a few words with each of us on the way in. Little did I know that he would become an international.
How times change. Yeah.
Exactly. And so I did that, and then I went to Rome, which was the start of my EU specialization as first secretary, Economic and European Union. And that was memorable because it was Margaret Thatcher came to Rome for European Council in, I think, 1990, maybe 1991. And that was the European Council where they passed a text to which she objected very strongly about economic and monetary union. And she walked out of the meeting on the second morning early and went home. And then there was a big row in the House of Commons. And I think he'd been Foreign Secretary Geoffrey Howe, but by that stage was leader of the House of Commons. He resigned over her attitude to Europe, and that led to her downfall. So it all started at that European Council in Rome, which I was attending. So history, the glorious thing, fascinating thing about a job in the Foreign Service is that everywhere you go, there is a chance that really quite big moments in history are going to happen. And I mean, I know you were in the military, you will have done some very exciting things, which are also, part of the historical story. But you just feel so fortunate, even if, as in this European Council in Rome, you're basically a bag carrier and you're going backwards and forwards to fetch documents and to look up things for people. And you're an onlooker, not really a participant, certainly not at that stage of your career, an advisor to the Prime Minister, but you see these momentous events going on. And I did 15 years basically on European policy, which culminated in my being Tony Blair's Europe advisor, and then going for 4 years to be permanent representative to the European Union and British ambassador to the European Union in Brussels, then national security advisor, and then Washington. So that takes us swiftly to the end. But it wasn't, the highlights weren't all just at the end of my career. I mean, there were fascinating moments all the way through, whether it was traveling around the Middle East, looking at what was going on in Gaza and the West Bank, going to Iraq during the Iran-Iraq war, all of this stuff. It was quite extraordinary.
Yeah, fascinating. I mean, what an amazing career as well when you look back on it. All those spots and spaces, as you say, sitting there on. I have, as you say, been in some of those kind of meetings when I was in the military where you think, wow, it's a pinch me moment. I mean, one of my ones like that was when actually 2011 I was in the Pentagon and I was Chief of Defence Staff's liaison to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And I was in the office with Mike Mullen, who was chairman when he was on a call to David Richards, and one of his phones rings, and this was the night after the first set of operations in Libya to basically unseat Gaddafi, and he looked at his phone switch and looked back at David Richards and said, "David, I'll have to put you on hold for a minute, sorry." And then turns back to his phone, picks it up, and as he sort of looked back, he looked through me, and I just did, "Do you want me to leave?" And he was, "No, no, no, you stay there." Picks the phone up, goes, "Yes, Mr. President," and downloads the whole thing to Obama from the first night's operation. And I go, wow. I mean, there was just me, him, and one of his aides in the office. What a privilege to be in that position. It was absolutely extraordinary, really. You must, I mean, we'll kind of come on to current stuff later on in terms of geopolitics and things, but when you look back at some of the places you've served and the people you've met and the things you've done, you must have an interesting reflection on a few of those issues. I mean, the Middle East, obviously, with what's going on at the minute, but Europe as well, with what's obviously happened, not least in terms of Brexit and so on. And that must be a mixture of emotions, I guess, for you, is it, in terms of things that you've done?
I guess so. I mean, let's take the Middle East, Bob, which as well as I do, in a sense. Do you serve, presumably? Did you serve
Yeah,
in?
I've done some time in Saudi when we were doing the southern no-fly zone. I've done a lot of flying over Iraq when we were doing the northern no-fly zone. So yeah, a fair bit.
It was always a very big issue in foreign policy, and the specialists were trained in Arabic. They spent their whole career in the Middle East. They really knew their stuff. And we put, I mean, you can imagine us putting a lot of effort into the oil-rich Gulf countries because we needed their energy, needed the best possible relations with them. We needed to make sure they weren't invaded by hostile forces and the global energy supply didn't dry up. So you can imagine the emphasis there. But then some of the best and brightest in the Foreign Office were put on the Arab-Israel dispute, and they spent their life working out how a two-state solution could be negotiated and what it would look like. And then you had countries like Egypt, which was always an economic basket case, and Libya with Gaddafi. And I visited all of those North African countries, Algeria, which was a bit of a tinderbox. And we put a lot of effort into those countries too. And I look at the Middle East now, and I remember the Arab Spring. I remember the then Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg coming across to Brussels, where I was at the time, and making a speech essentially about the flowering of democracy across those North African countries, and whether this would stretch to the Gulf as well, and talking about the importance of the rich European countries making sure lots of money was available to help the poorer Arab countries in this transition to proper democracies. And instead, what did we see? We saw basically countries fall apart. In Egypt's case, you had a military coup after the then Muslim Brotherhood leader who had been elected was overthrown. Tunisia is sort of the closest thing to have a success story. in the post-Arab Spring world, but that's very, very fragile. Um, Lebanon has blown up. Syria has absolutely collapsed, and it's a failed state now. Libya, you had the overthrow of Gaddafi, which you were involved in. And I remember going to Libya when I was national security advisor with David Cameron. About, 6 months after Gaddafi had fallen, and you could start to see the emergence of factions and divisions already. And Libya now is basically collapsed as a unitary state. So if I look across the Arab world, um, despite all the diplomatic efforts, and it wasn't just us, it was the Americans had put a huge amount of effort into trying to create a two-state solution, for example, all the way up to a number of presidents, Clinton amongst them, and of course under Obama, John Kerry tried very hard, and that's actually gone a long way backwards from where it was when I first visited that region. The Arab Spring actually led to the collapse of functioning states, even if they were run by appalling, brutal autocrats, and to a lot of failed states in the region. And so you just think to yourself, has Western diplomacy and Western efforts been complete failure? What did we do wrong? What could we have done differently to stop these things happening? Or maybe we shouldn't blame ourselves. Maybe there was just no way of stopping what has happened.
I think we do have unrealistic expectations sometimes. I mean, when I spent 9 months on the ground in Afghanistan in 2008, when obviously, which was when it was pretty difficult, and when you lived it on the ground, as I was in Kandahar, and I was off the base very regularly as well, meeting all sorts of tribal elders and up in Kabul regularly and so on, and then you had, as inevitably happens there, literally dozens of visits across my time, a lot of them political, some media, etc. And the expectation that you get, and the question, and not just UK politicians, by the way, lots of others as well. It was a NATO role for me, so I saw lots of different people. And I think it's going to sound a bit mean as a word, but the naivety in some ways when you look at the view from outside a country like that about what's actually going to happen and where it's going to end up. And funny old thing, it didn't at all. And I think the only thing that surprised me after we'd had the withdrawal, being kind about it, which was obviously a bit of a rout in the end, was the speed at which the Afghan structure collapsed completely and fell back to the Taliban. Not the fact that it did, because I think that was always kind of inevitable. And I do think we should learn some stuff from some of these historical things, and we sadly don't seem to do that very well.
If you look at there's a very good book called The Last King, about how Brits were drummed out of Afghanistan in the 1840s, and the last remnants of what was the East India Company army went across the Khyber Pass in winter, being picked off by Afghan warriors as they crossed, and a handful of them got out. I'm probably sure to a military man, this is all, this is well-known piece of history. But it's when you read the account of the build-up to that expulsion, that forcing out of the Brits, we made so many mistakes in how we handled the population in Kabul more widely, and the mistake of trying to impose a king who had no credibility on the Afghan system, such as it was. And you read it and you see all the parallels with trying to impose a leadership on Afghanistan between 2000 and 2020, and how, even though it changed from Karzai to Ashraf Ghani, neither of them really had credibility with the Afghan population. The local leaders did not. As you know, all this stuff.
Yeah, I think the local, not just the leadership, the local population, certainly around where I was, I mean, they didn't care at all about national government. They were interested in family, they were interested in tribe, they weren't interested in the borders that we had largely drawn. So it was these kind of things
Mm.
that I think where there was, that's what I mean by being a bit naive. I think there's a view that, well, okay, we can get a national government in place. It can be a democratic government. We can create the conditions for something more of a market
Yeah.
economy, and you kind of go, no, not if you sit there and look at the way they operate. There was no way we ever would have had the
Yeah.
strategic patience for that.
I have the greatest respect for British, American, the European military and others who worked in Afghanistan because they were set an impossible task. Because we got somehow dragged from going into Afghanistan to destroy Al Qaeda, and the idea was to capture bin Laden, which happened a few years later. And we somehow this evolved into nation building
Yeah.
and trying to impose Western systems and structures and democracy on a country that is completely incompatible with that. And we spent 20 years and billions, and 500 Brits lost their lives, and many more, some of them no doubt close friends of yours, wounded. And with hindsight, it was never going to work, as you say. And the people who got pushed from destroying Al Qaeda into nation building, that was politicians and civil servants and diplomats giving advice to their political masters. Why did we do it? How did we do it? How did that happen? I didn't
Yeah.
get into Afghanistan until well, I still took over as National Security Advisor in 2012. I was doing European policy all the time, all through the noughties, as it were. But when you got there, you thought to yourself, why did we find ourselves doing this? You may have had more of a perspective on that.
I think the interesting thing, isn't it, without digressing too far, is if you go back in time before we had modern communications, when almost to, I mean, I'm not trumpeting Days of Empire here, but I mean when it was Days of Empire, and you had people who were based out in countries for a long period of time, they served they inevitably got a much better knowledge and a much better set of relationships with the local community, etc., and were able to probably influence things in a slightly different way. I think one of the challenges in the modern world is you do have this constant communication, which is from distance and without a real feel on the ground. And I'll give you a silly example, but it's relevant. When I mentioned I was in Saudi, even before that was back in '98, and we had a big argument with the finance guys in what was then Strike Command and in the Air Force about they were arguing about the number of air conditioned vehicles we had. And of course this was below my level initially, and then it bubbled up to me and I said, have you actually been out here? Do you want to come and see what the conditions are like before you start suggesting that we should have less air conditioned vehicles? And of course we duly managed to get some people out, and of course very quickly the view changed because they realized that it was 45 plus degrees every day, and it was literally every day, and over 50 on a regular basis, and you couldn't possibly exist and function in a normal way without sort of air conditioning. I marvel actually when I look back at World War II and people fighting in the in North Africa in those kind of conditions with none of that. But I do think some of that, for all the things we've improved through time and in terms of our ability to do things, there are some disadvantages to kind of global reach and daily communication and so on, which can be quite challenging.
Just to move on a little bit, two other big regrets in my career. Number one, Ukraine. I was National Security Advisor 2012 to middle of 2015, so 3.5 years. And the first Russian invasion of Ukraine, when they took Crimea in a morning, and when Russian paramilitaries supposedly not in uniform, went across into the Donbass and started encouraging the separatists there to actually rise up and demand to be part of Russia, not Ukraine. The Western response then was very weak, very weak. There were some sanctions, but nothing like what they could have been, and there were no. We weren't supplying a lot of weapons to Ukraine because they hadn't, Crimea had just gone. And I think that Putin will have interpreted that weak Western reaction as an invitation to plot and plan and to prepare to do more. And I mean, people will point the finger in particular at Obama at that moment, who wasn't pushing for a much stronger reaction, I don't think. But all of us in Europe, not just the British government at the time, but others, settled on a sort of very, very light hand of sanctions. We kicked Putin out of or we already kicked him out of what was the G8 back? Went back to the G7 by then, I think. And there was a lot of political rhetoric against Putin. And I remember that Cameron had some very tough meetings with him. But essentially, he will have interpreted the West's reaction as saying, we're not that bothered about Ukraine, and he will have read the tea leaves and thought, we can do more. And I think, you always think to yourself, if we had been much, much tougher in 2014, would the invasion of 2022 have happened? That's one. And then the other on Brexit. Look, I did 15 years of my career negotiating in Brussels, sometimes flying off to meetings from London once a week, sometimes when I was posted twice to Brussels. And this was a period of negotiating special deals for the Brits. We kept ourselves out of the euro. We kept ourselves out of most bits of Schengen. Certainly, we insisted on keeping our frontier controls at the border, but we opted into those bits of Schengen that were useful to us, like all the secure sharing of security information and information about criminals traveling around Europe, this kind of stuff, the sort of data sharing. And the big one in my time, we negotiated the budget down in the budget negotiations of 2004. And while I was working as Europe advisor for Tony Blair, we did what became the Lisbon Treaty, which was full of the Brits blocking things like qualified majority voting on foreign policy decisions, and more British exceptionalism, things that we stopped or didn't apply to us. So by the time you get to the Brexit vote, the Brits have a undeniably special deal that kept us out of all the most integrating things in the European treaties. We weren't in Schengen, we weren't part of the sort of common travel area, and we weren't in the euro, and we had blocked things like majority voting on foreign policy, and we had stopped the whole European Defence Initiative pretty much in its tracks because we thought priority should be NATO. And I just seems to me, and meanwhile we had pushed the single market very strongly, which was a British idea, and that was a great boost to our economy, to everyone's economy, but we did very well out of the single market. So when Brexit happened, what I mostly thought to myself was, if we ever decide this was a mistake, we want to go back in, we won't get all those special deals and those exceptions, I'm afraid. It'll be, if you want to come back in, you'll have to join the euro, you have to join Schengen in full, all of this stuff, all this British exceptionalism. I'm not going to have that anymore. So, you think to yourself, hundreds and hundreds of hours negotiating to get all those exceptions, those special deals for the UK, and it's all gone and it won't ever come back.
I can imagine how frustrating that must be. I mean, interestingly, I put my colours on the mast. I'm firmly in the Remain camp and always was. I was very, very disappointed when we voted to leave, and particularly the way it was handled. Frankly, on both sides, I think the way the argument was made in the referendum debate, I don't think was helpful to the public who are not aware of a lot of the detail. But I think the most disappointing thing for me was having campaigned to get us out, the Leave campaign when they won, essentially didn't have a plan. And and that was incredibly frustrating. And I think you still see a little bit of that now with some of the stuff that we were talking up very big about, control of our borders and all those sorts of things. I mean, illegal immigration has gone up, not down. And these sorts of things, which are just, I think incredibly frustrating, which, now lots of people, in fact, interestingly, quite a lot of people I know who did vote Leave, are kind of at least on the fence, if not actually actively thinking, well, we made a mistake. But it is what it is. And we are, as you say, we are where we are. And I don't think I wouldn't vote to go back in now because we would, as you say, lose all of those benefits we did have. And I
Um,
wouldn't want to be back in on kind of egalitarian terms with everyone else. I think that would be crazy.
yeah, I think that's a very fair analysis. I mean, the biggest, apart from the whole losing all of our special deals, I think the biggest mistakes in the Brexit story, and I was abroad for some of it in the States, were the idea of a renegotiation. Number one, because you were never going to get very much out of that, and to to need a renegotiation, you had to. David Cameron had to say there are things about our current deal in Europe that are really bad that have to be renegotiated. So you can't. It's very hard to say Europe is really good for us, but actually we've got so much stuff we need to get changed to make it, actually acceptable. So he starts off with we need renegotiation, and as was inevitable, there wasn't very much. Certainly, what there was some good things in the renegotiation deal, but it was all very technical stuff, and you could never make a headline uh, for a newspaper out of any of it. But you'd already you had implied to people that there was something seriously wrong with the deal we had previously before we did the renegotiation. And that's a very difficult basis on which to fight a negotiation. Second, Theresa May, once the vote out had happened, I think that she triggered the Article 50 process way too early. I think you should have had a proper, you should have had a white paper or a green paper or a royal commission or whatever. You should have had a paper that set out all the different options, because Brexit is a very, Brexit is a title, but there are so many different things that Brexit could be, from a very hard line out of everything to staying inside the single market, for example. And should have had a proper analysis, independent analysis of all of those options, put that to the House of Commons as a whole, and said which of these commands the most support, which commands a majority. Instead of which we triggered Article 50, which set a 2-year deadline without knowing what we wanted.
Mm.
And then we start negotiating, and then Parliament chucks out the deal. And you were in the country at that stage, presumably. I was in America, but it looked utterly chaotic
Yeah, I was more than
from
in the country. I was actually part of the No Deal planning. I was in the
really,
when I was working for Deloitte at that stage and was in the cabinet office doing the national security side of the No Deal planning. So I
yeah.
wrote the security related impact statement for what that was going to look like. And yeah, I mean, I can completely agree with you. I think
I mean,
it
Bob,
was
there is no more basic rule in negotiating than know what you want before you start to negotiate. I
mm,
mean, really, really, making up taking a decision on what you actually want, a great sort of, very painful debate while the clock is ticking, is just insane. And the third thing that is just strikes me nowadays extraordinary is a lot of the people. I mean, there's obviously some rethinking amongst some of those who voted leave, but some of the great advocates of leave are now saying Brexit's a disaster. And they say it's a disaster because it was done so badly and we could have got a much, much better deal. But they say it's a disaster. A government which is composed 90%, 95%, and a party of Remainers is reduced to defending the deal that we've done. And the people who supported it all are saying that's all rubbish. It's a terrible deal. How did that come about? How do we
I
get
know.
ourselves quite so back to front as that?
It is extraordinary time in politics generally, isn't it? I mean, that takes us probably neatly into, while we're on this kind of geopolitical type of stuff, there's a couple of things I'd like to talk to you about and then come back to a bit of your personal leadership experience, if I
Mm.
may. But the the time you spent first as national security advisor and the experience that gave you, when you look now at where we UK are as a country in terms of looking at defence and what the sort of defence argument is going, where obviously strategic defence review done, national security strategy redone, all of those good things, the
Mm.
sort of vector seems to be in the right direction. But one of the things I've said to a couple of people recently is it started out looking as though it was pretty positive, and I think the review itself was pretty positive in the way it was originally framed. I was amused listening to a different podcast the other day, which is one that Tom Newton Dunn does with Patrick Sanders, and the former chief of the general staff. And Patrick was saying it's gone through the Whitehall blanderizer, which I thought was a lovely description, because the risk, I think, is that most of the conversation has gone quickly back to health, education, and welfare, and very little about defence. And although obviously, yes, in theory, we've all signed up, NATO have all signed up to 5%, with 3.5 and 1.5 split, etc. For what's going to happen going forward. I'm concerned about whether that is reality, and I'm very concerned
Yeah.
about the time frame. And I'd just be really interested in your perspectives.
I think your concerns are well-founded. I think two things about this. One, it's a really strange way to describe, I acknowledge, Ukraine. Ukraine has the leadership. I mean, I'm not a big fan of Boris Johnson's prime ministership, but he was very good on Ukraine, and so was Sunak, and so has Starmer been. And that has done a great deal to give us some respectability and credibility back on the international stage after the utter chaos of the Brexit years. And so, it's, I mean, we have done well on that, and we now carry, I mean, because we have such high quality armed forces, and because our political leaders have sort of rallied to this course and shown some leadership on it, in some ways, that's restored us to the inner circle of collective European policy formulation, which without Ukraine we might not have got. So in that sense, government has done well, and we've re-established our international credentials quite effectively through it. With one proviso, we no longer are sitting around that table in Brussels with 27 other countries taking the detailed decisions on money for Ukraine, on sanctions, on where things should, what money should be spent on the balance between military aid and humanitarian aid and all these other things. And so we're not actually at the table. And if we were at the table, having spent 15 years of my career doing this, we would be the biggest voices alongside the French and the Germans. And we would be shaping the decisions that Europe is taking on how it contributes to defending Ukraine and supporting Ukraine. And so that is a miss. But other than that, successive prime ministers have done very well on the international stage in showing leadership and expounding principles on this, and some of them have been very articulate on it. So that's restored a certain amount of our credibility. But the next stage you identify is absolutely correctly is, are we actually good for what we have promised on restoring defense spending? I don't know how much you heard this when you've been in Washington. One of the things I remember from my time as national security advisor and then from my time as ambassador in Washington is when you got into a private conversation with a senior American general over a dinner or over a drink or just in the corridor, they would say to you that they had the hugest respect for the quality of the British Armed Forces, especially our special forces, but also, I mean, just the rank and file, the infantry, and all the rest of it. But an army of less than 100,000 is too small, they would say, and you're just not spending enough. And you built these aircraft carriers, which are great, but you can't afford enough planes to go on them and this kind of stuff. And you would hear this, I mean, they would be public and with ministers, they'd be very supportive and very positive about the contribution we're making, but privately would say to you, you've got to spend a bit more. Now, proper military people would say it's not a question of numbers, and you can, we can have American planes on the aircraft carriers as well as ours. There's ways around all of this, but some of them would say also, but the Americans have a point, and I think they have a point. And the previous defense reviews which I was involved in, could you contribute? Could you fight effectively in two different conflicts around the world at the same time? And the claim was always that we could. I'm not sure we can do that anymore.
I think we've been very with the MOD side, and having sat in the MOD a lot, obviously at the latter stages of my career. I mean, we've always been a bit guilty of, certainly in public because we kind of had to, but also in private to some extent, always being too can do about some of this stuff.
Yeah,
We've never failed. We've never
yeah,
failed to deliver anything
that's
because,
right.
and that's just not the style. You don't want to fail, you want to deliver. But the
Mhm.
reality is we have allowed ourselves to be death by a thousand cuts. And,
Yeah,
that has not been helpful at all. And yes, the quality over quantity argument has some sway to a certain extent in the technological bits of what we do, but the reality is quantity has a quality all of its own, and and we have
yeah.
definitely allowed that to become too fragile in all sorts of areas, and not just in actual
Yeah.
numbers, but in things like flying hours, in tank miles, in Navy ships, the time we're spending doing stuff with them, etc. So I think there's all those kind of things that play into it, which we've been partially architects of our own demise, which has not been helpful. I mean, but at the same
Yeah.
time, everyone's taken advantage of that over decades, not recent years.
Yeah, well, that's the authoritative voice of a practitioner, and you're dead right. And look, I sat around the National Security Council table for 3.5 years, and I think there were three, certainly no, two chiefs of defense staff in that time, and their deputies who sometimes attended. And to a man, their line when the Prime Minister said to them, "Can you do this?" When we're talking about whether it was in Libya or Afghanistan or wherever, was always, yes, we can, we will deliver. There would then be some qualifications come in, and there would usually be, and if only we had this and this and this, we could do much better. But there was always, yes, of course we can deliver. And I understand that. And, it's like a diplomat's saying when the Prime Minister says, "Well, is there anything we can do here?" We say, "Well, you can do this and this and this," because you can't say we're impotent, we can't do anything, you just have to watch from the sidelines. Because they always ministers will then say, "What are we paying you guys for if you're not
Mm.
going to come up with some ideas and something you can actually do so that the UK can contribute to solving this?" So, yes, they did. But my point is going to be that last defence review, I think, is very, very good, and I have a lot of time for Richard Barrons, who was, I think, a lot of the intellectual force behind it. I think he's one of the cleverest generals I came across in my career. And George Robertson is just a renowned international statesman. So this was a really good team, and that's a very, very good defence review. And you have the commitment out of the last NATO summit about 3.5% on defence, another 1.5% on defence-related stuff, and that's all right as well. But we've got to do it. Got to do it. And the key to us climbing to the next level in terms of our international effectiveness and relevance, and how seriously we're taken in Washington, and how seriously we are taken on the continent, and of course, importantly, how seriously we're taken by countries like Russia and China, is whether or not we deliver on this. And we don't have a magic money tree, let alone a plantation of them. And so you've got to find the money either from generating economic growth at much better levels than we've had for the last decade or so, or cuts elsewhere, or what funds we have, prioritizing this, prioritizing defense. And that's the difficult question for any government, but it's very hard for a Labour government. All this pressure for them to spend more on public services.
Yeah, I think particularly in the context of the public not really feeling the defense risk.
Yeah.
I mean, actually, Richard Barrons obviously was my boss in my last two jobs, actually, while I was in the MOD.
Oh,
And
right. You know well. Yeah.
yeah, very well. And I completely share your view. I think he's a fantastic guy. And I mean, he made a great point in a presentation not that long ago where he was saying, if you're talking about spending 5% of your GDP on defense, essentially as a deterrent for war,
Mm.
then you need to think about the consequences of not doing that if we actually end up in a major conflict. Where the
Yeah.
reality is, in a state on state conflict, you're 25% or more of your GDP going on it, with all of the attendant consequences that go with it in terms of the death, destruction, destabilization, and all the rest of it. And you only have to look at somewhere like Ukraine to see that in terms of the scale of the devastation that comes from it. And I think that the problem we have right now is that the public don't feel that, with good reason, to be honest. I think, they still view it as it's a long way away, and yes, it makes the news
Yeah.
and so on and so forth, but they're not actually feeling the attendant risks of,
Yeah.
and actually some of the stuff that Russia in particular is already doing. I mean, the without question, in terms of cyber, in terms of risks to undersea cables and disruption to our way of life. I'm kind of the view, you'd expect me probably as a military guy to say, hard power is the way it is, we need more and more of that. The reality is, I think that you can lose a war these days just by losing your cyber system completely, losing your electricity grid, losing your banking system, losing the supply chain, that everything's just in time. So within hours,
Yeah.
the supermarkets would start running out of stuff. Those sorts of things are going to be completely unhinging for the population. And
Yeah.
that's a
You see
problem.
the chaos in Spain when they had that massive power cut.
Yeah, exactly.
What that
Yeah.
did. And that's why the extra 1.5% for defense related stuff is so important, because the criteria there are very wide. And I think a lot of that money should be spent on exactly what you've identified as key weaknesses. You have to protect your infrastructure much better. You have to protect your communication systems much better, protect your energy distribution much, much better. Because if those things go wrong, you can lose the war, as you say, within hours.
Yeah, and you need to have a view, I think, on which again I think's been weak on successive governments, really, where they've taken too much of a view that we can sell some of this stuff off, or we can allow external supply chain into it, where actually some of this requires national sovereignty. I mean, if you
Yeah.
want genuine security, you have to own it.
Mm.
All aspects of it, and I think it's definitely a factor. No, really, really interesting. I mean, I'd like to take you on to the next thing, really, because
Yeah, go on.
I can't have an ex-US ambassador on and not talk about the US. We're both
Mm.
your own time. I mean, obviously, I mean, your book, which is an outstanding book, by the way. I loved it.
Thank you.
I listened to the audio book, and which is, it really brings it to life. I always like it when the author reads the book, and you kind of get, particularly when obviously knowing you a bit, knowing the pain that must have been in some ways when you were in the States with what happened with the leaks and so on, that ultimately caused your resignation, and but having worked in Trump one, and seen that transition, seen the time, that went through, and now looking at it with Trump two and all the stuff that's gone on, and very currently, obviously, with what's happening with, Lord Mandelson just having been sacked as U.S. ambassador. Your perspectives on all of this, and your reflections to an extent, in terms of, as far as you're able to go on your own time in Washington and what that
Yeah.
meant, but then also your kind of perspectives on the relationship and where it is going forward.
The thing about Trump one um, was it came as a huge surprise. I mean, the opinion polls had said that Clinton would win, and the American mainstream media collectively thought Trump wasn't fit to be president. And the result was a huge shock to the system. And there was a feeling that there was a lack of legitimacy to it because of Russian interference and because he hadn't won the popular vote. And there was open warfare really between the US media and Trump for the whole of his first term. And it was there was a real lack of knowledge in the Trump team in the White House on how to make things happen, how to run government, which meant that there was that they made a lot of mistakes in the first couple of years. And then you had the pandemic where they also made a lot of mistakes. And he lost the election. And a lot of people felt, especially after the events of 6th of January and the storming of the Capitol, cited by Trump very clearly, that there was no chance that he would come back. Now, his return, I think the Democrats carry a lot of the responsibility for that.
Mm.
I think the idea of Biden, it's now clear to everyone, the idea of Biden running for a second term was insane. He should have declared from the outset that he would be a one-term president, that his role was to bring America back together again, restore relations with the allies, restore tough policies on Russia and this sort of stuff, and then pass the mantle to a younger man or woman. And if you read a book by someone I knew when I was in Washington called Jake Tapper, called Original Sin, which is a detailed account, all the evidence that accumulated over the 4 years of Joe Biden of why his health was failing, his physical health. I mean, his team thought he should have been in a wheelchair by the end of his term. His mental acuity wasn't that he had Alzheimer's or anything, but he just became more and more forgetful and less and less able to concentrate to the degree an American president needs to concentrate for all the hours an American president needs to work. And so it was crazy putting him up for a second term and basically handed the election to Donald Trump. Kamala Harris would not, I think, have emerged as the candidate if there had been a proper primary process, but she did a better job than a lot of us expected when she was the candidate. But they failed to have policies to try and pull the Trump base away from him, especially the blue collar workers working from paycheck to paycheck, and struggling every day to make ends meet. There weren't really any policies in the Democrat locker to address those people. So the whole thing was massively mishandled, I think. And we have Trump 2. Trump 2 it's Trump feeling validated by the fact that this time he won bigger in every state and in every demographic than in the first term. He won a popular majority this time. He has a team of much more experienced people in the White House who are much more loyal. They are supporters and enablers and amplifiers. The Republican Party has become the Trump Party, so he's got complete support there, it seems. The Supreme Court leans heavily rightwards, and he now has his eye on his place in the history books. So it is very different, it feels, Trump. And you can feel a change in the attitude from the American media. They now accept that he is a legitimate president, that he won, the majority of the American people, and they still don't like a lot of his policies, but there is no longer the feeling that he has no right to be in the White House. And so it has a different feel to it this time. What he's doing domestically is unquestionably very radical, putting National Guard on the streets of Washington, wanted to do that also in Chicago and LA. The activities of ICE in rounding up illegal migrants in huge numbers, all this stuff is very radical and very divisive in America. And in foreign policy, I think that he's obsessed by Obama's Nobel Peace Prize, and he wants one himself. And so you're seeing Trump the peacemaker, unburdened by much knowledge of the detailed reasons why countries have gone to war and what needs to be put into place to achieve progress on this. But nevertheless, I'm glad he is trying. And if he learns as he goes along and can get anywhere, we'll all have to welcome it. But it feels very different, is my essential point. And I think $64,000 question here in terms of longer term relations between Britain and America, between Europe and America, and in terms of the shape of the world for a long time to come is, I think Trump has changed America. I think that in terms of foreign policy, the confrontation with China will outlast him because there's a national security consensus in America now that China is the existential challenge for the 21st century. So that's going to continue. I think that a sort of withdrawal of sorts from, I think the NATO summit was a success, and we've handled that quite well in Europe. And provided we deliver what we promised to do in terms of defense spending, then NATO will be all right. We have to accept that America is going to be less interested in Europe in the future, and it's up to us to look after ourselves more and spend more, while there is this focus on China and a focus on the homeland, and a sort of focus, I think, on Latin America as well. And then on tariffs, the striking thing here is, although Biden denounced Trump's policies at the time when Trump was president the first term, he didn't roll back those tariffs on China in particular. He kept them all. And there's a lot more tariffs now. The average level of the tariffs is now, I think, about 17% if you take the average of global tariffs, US tariffs. That's going to have a long-term effect on the global economy, and have a long-term effect on Europe's trade with the US. Even if we keep it as low as it is, 10% tariffs on the UK, 15% on Europe, and it could go higher. Remember, there could be new tariffs at any point over the next 3.5 years. So the whole free trade basis of international trade is now under question. And I don't think a future government in America, future administration, whether it's Democrat or Republican, can be guaranteed to lift those tariffs unless they prove over the next 3 years to have been a disaster, which they could. And then last of all, Bob, I mean, the whole Make America Great Again, the whole sort of that slogan that has captured the American people twice now. I think whoever wins in 2028 and beyond, expect a more nationalist America, more devoted to securing its own objectives and its own interests, less interested in being an international policeman, certainly very reluctant to send American troops overseas in the way they did with Afghanistan and Iraq. That's just the shape of the future. And we're going to have to cope with that internationally, and cope with that in Europe, and certainly do better in terms of defending ourselves, but also means a rethink about how we tackle international problems that carry risks for us, because I think the Middle East is looking as unstable as it ever has. So the world has changed, and the next generation of diplomats and of military and of governments are going to have to work out how we cope with that and make the best of it.
Yeah, fascinating insights. I think last question before we move back to you, but we're just 2 days on, I think, from the tragic shooting of Charlie Kirk, and I mean, I'd never heard of him. I have to confess, I didn't, was not aware at all of his profile and so on. But I think that obviously political assassination essentially, looks like there's no question about that, and absolutely appalling act. But it's just one of many that seem to have gone on kind of both sides when you look at it. And I just wonder where does that end? Does this actually prove as a kind of any chance of this becoming a moment where people go, yeah, enough's enough, we need to do something different, or is this going to make it worse? What's your thought?
Look, I mean, the first thing to say is obviously that is a tragedy, and it's a tragedy for the family, and it's a very worrying development in terms of political violence in America. But there's a lot of this going on, and it's not that many months ago when someone broke into Nancy Pelosi's house, found she wasn't in, and beat up her husband. I think has done some permanent injuries to him. So political violence is on both sides of the political spectrum, and obviously, it's so easy to get guns in America that any lunatic can sort of go into a shop and buy a gun and try and shoot someone. And it still is happening a lot in American schools as well. I mean, if you look at the gun incidents in American schools, they happen monthly. We hear about the big ones when people are killed, but it looks like a very violent society. So do I think that there is going to be a turning point? I don't at the moment, I'm afraid. I think this will carry on. I mean, there is such a deep division in America now. There are so many guns owned by people. There is so much bitterness and rancor in that division. I'm afraid I think any politician in America must feel vulnerable now. Even people who aren't actually in office, like the guy who's just been assassinated, but who are out there on the social media and are big influencers. Everyone is vulnerable now, and so I think it'll continue. I hope it won't get worse, but it could. Yeah, if you're an American politician and you expect to go back to your state or your district and do town hall meetings or meet the public or anything like that, you must be really worried now about what could happen.
Yeah, yeah. 100%. I think that's the worst aspect of it, isn't it? It's the is that the vast majority of those sort of people do not have the levels of security that clearly a president or a vice president does. And
Yeah,
it's
exactly. And I mean, you are your job as a politician representing your state or your district. You can't do that really without meeting the people who
yeah,
vote.
yeah, totally.
And also, particularly meeting the people who don't vote for you, so you can try and persuade them next time they will. That
Yeah, no,
just looks
I
so
agree.
risky now.
A few sort of quick ones to finish, if you don't mind. I
Also,
always try and cover highs and lows of
yeah.
people's lives. You've clearly had an amazing set of experiences. What's the high point?
Yes. What's the high point? Look, I think there have been so many and so many things I've really enjoyed doing and so many extraordinary experiences. Um, Look, maybe the high point was, and this will sound a kind of slightly strange and random thing that I'm plucking from my career. I mean, my time doing Bosnia during the Bosnia War and the aftermath to that war, and seeing the Dayton Peace Agreement go through and our part in that, and I was basically with uh, one official in the MOD. The two of us planned together the whole British involvement in Bosnia, the troops we sent out who did an amazing job and that kind of thing. That was hugely satisfying. If I had to pick one thing, I was EU advisor for Tony Blair from 2004 to 2007. I got on very well with him. I worked very closely with him. And I drew on all of my experience negotiating in Europe to say to him, well, the two big negotiations he did, one was the 2004 budget negotiation, and then there was negotiation on the Lisbon Treaty. And both of these were tricky for us because we wanted different things from the other EU. And I remember writing stuff for him both times. We concluded the budget deal during the British presidency, so he was actually in the chair. I told him beforehand what I thought we could achieve, where the deal could be done, and how you had to handle the negotiating stages to get there, which with that budget deal, this will sound crazy, but I basically said you've got to take all the money that people are expecting, in terms of new money, off the table and put some proposals down that everyone will hate because they are huge cuts to all the budgets. And they will send them all crazy and they'll all shout abuse at you and they'll be furious with you and you'll have all sorts of angry contacts with your fellow prime ministers. But what you do is you get to the European Council and you give a bit of it back. And they all start celebrating. They've got a bit more money and they forget that originally they'd expected to get twice times as much as they're getting. And it worked. And we got the deal, and the Treasury still thought it was too expensive. But if you consider the sums that people were expecting, it was the first budget deal with the Central European countries in, who were all expecting vast riches. And they still got a lot of money, but they got less than they were expecting, less than they were hoping. But they did the deal because it felt so much better than the first proposal that they put on the table. But to get that, ministers, foreign secretary as well, and the treasury, the chancellor, but most of all the prime minister, were going to have to accept a lot, being very unpopular for 6 months with their European partners. Politicians don't on the whole like being unpopular, but if you promise them if they do that, they'll get a deal that basically meets our budget requirements, and it worked.
Fascinating. Yeah, that must be very, very satisfying. I can see that. I mean, sadly, for every high point, there's obviously a low point, pretty much.
Yeah,
So what's the
and
low point?
well, you might expect me to say it was the leaking of my report at Washington, but actually it wasn't. And I'll tell you why. Because I was 5 months off retirement then, because I was very confident in what I had written, that it was accurate in terms of my description of the setbacks and mistakes of Trump administration, and because there were an awful lot of people who were saying, of course you have to resign. I mean, it wasn't fired, I resigned. Of course you couldn't do the job anymore, but you were dead right in your reporting. So, that wasn't it. And it was, if it had been 20 years before the end of my career, that would have been quite a blow. But it was 6 months before the end. What I remember as a particular blow, and there's a nice ending to this, which is why I like to tell this story. I was hoping to get, and I thought I was front runner to get, a very senior ambassador, I won't go into detail on it, uh, in about 2003, 2004. It was a job I'd been working towards for about a decade. I thought I was nailed on to get it. And I got a phone call after the board to say, actually, they chose someone else. And if you are convinced in your own mind you are the best candidate, that you put all the hours in, all the work in to get there, uh, and you're pretty confident that you've done the deals, you've impressed the ministers who because it had been cleared with ministers that I wasn't going to get it. You feel, first of all, what was the last 10, 15 years for all that work? And second, where does this leave me now?
Mm.
Because if I haven't got it this time, well, I'm perfectly positioned for it. I'm not going to get it next time. So what's going to happen? Is this basically in my career? I had to accept a posting at a level down from this one and then go off into retirement. It wasn't really how I wanted things to finish. So you go through a few sort of dark moments thinking, has this blown everything up? And is that really, the end of my career ambitions? And then 4 weeks later, someone, the then Europe advisor to the Prime Minister, resigns very suddenly, unexpectedly. And essentially, the inside story is he had a big disagreement with the Prime Minister of an aspect of policy, Europe policy, and said, well, I understand you take a different view on this, Prime Minister, but I think probably I should move on because this was really important to me. Against it. So suddenly I get a phone call, literally 4 weeks after I had failed to get this job I'd been expecting, say, and there was a short interview, but basically they said Prime Minister is thinking you to become his new Europe advisor. Go across and have a chat with him tomorrow afternoon, and then expect you to get the job. And I did, and I did get the job. And there is nothing quite like the feeling, Bob, of walking over the threshold of that historic door, going into this little office in number 10 and going to your first meeting as the Europe advisor. And I then did 3 years in that job. And you learn more doing that than anything else in your career because you're right at the center. Everything flows through you. You go to cabinet meetings. You're in all the prime minister's meetings with European leaders. And it was just the most extraordinary experience. And you have a sense of awe and of history every time you walk across that threshold. And you think about, you're allowed to bring your family and your friends on Saturdays once a month around number 10. You take them around, you take them to the cabinet office, you cabinet them to the cabinet room, you take them up to the drawing rooms upstairs where Margaret Thatcher used to sit, or where they entertain foreign guests, or where they have a lunch for a foreign leader, or whatever. I mean, there's so much history soaked into the walls there. You show them the scars in the cabinet room where the windows broke when that IRA bomb landed in the garden.
Yep.
And some of them, there are fragments and damage to the plasterwork that has never been repaired, just so people remember that. So, I got the most fascinating job of my career 3 weeks after failing to get the job I'd wanted more than any other. And then after that, I went to Brussels. So, moral of the story is, if you've done the hard yards, you've done the work, even if what you imagine is your rightful promotion doesn't come up, if you've done the work, something else will come in. There's always opportunity around the corner. comes from the most unexpected direction.
Yeah, it's an amazingly common story, isn't it? Fantastic. Hey, very last question, Kim, which is one I always ask, and you will have had a lot of these over your career, so this might be a difficult choice, but what is the most difficult question you've ever been asked?
The most difficult question. Oh, goodness. I mean, there are lots of questions to which you don't know the answer when you're just in with a minister and you're discussing problem. He'll say, "What about this? What about this?" And you'll say, "I have to come back to you on that," or I'll find out. I'll give you an answer in 2 minutes. Not that kind of thing. The question I find, and this may be not really what you're driving for, but the question I find always quite difficult is people often say in interviews, describe your leadership style. And I've never read one of these management guru books in my life, I'm afraid. And I don't really think I have a leadership style. And they've said, what's the one thing that you think defines a good leader? And I'm always useless on these questions, but I'll tell you one thing that I used to do. All the jobs I did, running the European Secretary of the Cabinet Office, running the European Departments of the Foreign Office, UPREP, Washington, National Security Advisor. And that is to use the team and their specialist knowledge, because you can't know everything when you're at the top of the thing, every day as fully as you can. And one of the things I would do is, if I was writing a note to the Prime Minister, suggesting what he should do on something, or just updating him on stuff or whatever, I would send it around the people who were dealing with the policy in that particular area and say, "Do you have any amendments?" Now, usually they would say that's the wrong way around. They should write the draft and then I would amend it. But I like to write my own stuff. But I wanted their expertise, and I would encourage them to suggest changes and drafts and new points, whatever. And unless I absolutely disagreed with it, I would always put them in, even if it made it a bit longer or awful to the flow or whatever. Because if you want to create a proper team, you need to make everyone on the team feel valuable and feel they are contributing. And if there's one way you can do that very easily, it is to take their comments on a draft or a document or anything like that that you are producing and make sure you use them, and then send it back to them so they can see that they have contributed. And that's not like bringing them in for a little pep talk. That is showing them that they actually have contributed, because the note that's gone to the Prime Minister or the Foreign Secretary, whatever, contains their words just there, because that's their contribution. That makes them feel really good about it, and it really builds teamwork. And it encourages them to say in future, well, actually, I think you may be wrong on this, or you need to add this, or this isn't quite right, or whatever, because they know that you have taken their contributions in the past. Now, it sounds a very obvious point, but I think it's actually quite rare.
Yeah, I think you're completely right, and it's a terrific point to finish on, because that's such a powerful thing, and I 100% agree with you. And yeah, interesting. I would have, had we had more time today, I would have definitely talked a bit more about leadership style. So I'm glad I didn't, given it's obviously a difficult question. But Kim, you've been fantastic. Really, really great
Real
insights.
pleasure.
I knew it would be. Thank you very, very much indeed. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure. Thanks.
I hope you've enjoyed this conversation with Kim Darroch. It's a terrific privilege to have a man of his standing on the podcast, and I think his insights are incredibly valuable and really, really useful to anyone, really, in terms of what we're actually trying to achieve with this. So if you did, then as I said at the beginning, please think about that liking, supporting, feedback, commenting, reposting, subscribing, all of that stuff. Do everything you can to help share this, boost it, get other people to listen to it. That would be really appreciated. And if you're into the value thing, then please do Patreon. The links are in your platform on YouTube or on your podcast platform in the support the show link. Just go to that and then you'll be able to subscribe. That would be hugely, hugely appreciated. I'll be back next week with another fantastic guest, and really hope you've enjoyed this one and look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks very much indeed. Bye now.